The Winter Classic game in the state of hockey, Minnesota, was the ice cap night game on January 1st slate, but sadly not slotted as the night's final NHL game. The Winter Classic in Minnesota was everything it needed to be. It filled all the checkboxes. The NHL schedule around it before or after, but not ideally as it was done with both, or this year, most dumbfoundedly during the game itself, is something the NHL needs to get their collective heads out of their rear moment. It's not a slight on Minnesota, however, because the NHL schedule makers don't understand the concept of a marquee game equaling one exclusive hockey broadcast moment is required for such a showcase. It's a no-brainer. If you remember Lake Tahoe a year ago, the same schedule problem. The NHL had Vegas versus Colorado the one day and an Eastern team duo play the following day. It was 4 teams in 2 days of Tahoe, and that was also overkill. The first game, by the start time of the Vegas versus Colorado afternoon tilt, wasn't the first NHL game that day because I think New Jersey or Buffalo or some Eastern team or two began at noon Central Standard Time, and puck drop for the outdoor game in Tahoe was 2 p.m. Central Standard Time, if I'm remembering correctly. The conditions at Lake Tahoe put the game on pause after the first period of play. It finished later at night, but I do remember the NHL had a full slate of games the day Colorado played Vegas, and the Tahoe game wasn't first nor finished last, even with the long delay in between. And 2 teams did the event the next evening all over again. That absolutely cheapened the outdoor concept. Now, outdoor games have one thing the NHL can't control, what the weather ends up being to forecast a game's start time officially. It was too warm in Lake Tahoe, remember, that the afternoon game ended up finishing as an evening game because it was actually too nice. If the Tahoe game had been the first on that day's schedule, and it wasn't, and it resumed hours later to be concluded while NHL games were being played, thus had other NHL games actually on opposite it, and the NHL really should make any marquee game the only NHL game on. The Lake Tahoe Day slate of NHL games didn't do that, nor likewise for this year's Winter Classic in Minnesota. Now, I don't mind the NHL afternoon games prior to this year's Winter Classic, nor if the NHL were to make the Winter Classic the first and an afternoon start, but make it the only game to either start the new year or have it end the NHL schedule of the New Year's Day. Point is, pick one of those 2 times and have it the only NHL game on while it's being played. End of story. You have it, and while it's played, and why I thought of Lake Tahoe's Colorado versus Vegas, because that's a game that had a delay that would have put an unexpected wrench in what I'm saying, should always be the case without any exception. The outdoor game should be the only NHL game on as a first game or last game of an NHL scheduled day. Stadium Series games should have the same spotlight. Tahoe should have, and absolutely no NHL team game, as Toronto and Ottawa did this year, should be played while the Winter Classic game is on. Never, ever. First, is Ottawa's attendance so bad that their owner Eugene Melnyk kept the game on the schedule when all the other Canadian games, such as Winnipeg in Calgary on New Year's Eve, the day before, was canceled, that it without fan wasn't actually a revenue loss for the league because no one's attending Ottawa games? It's to say, even without fans, as a way to postpone the game that shouldn't be played while the Winter Classic is on in the first place, it went ahead. The NHL found a way to cheapen its marquee event yet again. Truth is, the number of Ottawa postponed games is way too high. They need to play them even with no fans. The second part is Sportsnet begged the game be played and wanted it opposite the Winter Classic, as Sportsnet's own Elliot Friedman confirmed on 32 Thoughts, the podcast. Now, I could stomach Toronto versus Ottawa in the afternoon prior. That would have had me watch Chicago in Nashville, as I actually did watch. But point is, Sportsnet is so out of touch with its Canadian viewers outside of Toronto to know the better part of the audience was watching the Winter Classic, and a lot of Canadians were doing so on a U.S. network feed, not on Sportsnet's duo coverage, to avoid any listening to Ottawa and Toronto's game. I'm only watching Toronto play Central Division teams because they are playing them. If the NHL went to a schedule where the East teams only met the West teams in the Stanley Cup Final, my dream of never watching Toronto ever again would be completely possible. And if you wonder why Toronto fans are the NHL's worst hockey fan base with respect to the rest of the National Hockey League, this is a prime example of why they are. You reward that fan base to watch their mediocre team versus a basement dweller provincial rival while they miss what can best be described as the most Canadian-like American Winter Classic game to ever be put on by the NHL. The Toronto market gets to watch their own team play what is best described as a regional, non-marquee, fanless attended game instead. And tons of hockey fans in Canada actually couldn't have cared less that the game was being played at all. Most hockey fans were watching the Winter Classic. That Toronto fan base can't learn to appreciate the rest of the NHL because of the NHL and the broadcaster right holders in of themselves. Likewise, had Minnesota's Winter Classic gem finished off the day as the last game after a slate of afternoon NHL games, that would solidify its marquee-deserving game status that it was. No, the NHL runs the Toronto versus Ottawa game during the Winter Classic, and not one but two West Coast games after it, in Seattle and Los Angeles. The Winter Classic is one of 9 games that makes the Winter Classic game neither the first game nor the last game on the schedule, and absolutely deplorable from a marketing standpoint, not even the lone NHL game on when it was being played. Don't tell me about how the NHL wants to grow the game. What an epic fail by the NHL and its clueless stakeholders. It's a sentiment shared on Twitter by NHL agent Alan Walsh. Chicago goalie Marc-Andre Fleury is one of the players he represents. In Walsh's succinct tweet, I reshared on Twitter that day. These big stage special event marquee games deserve to be in the spotlight and be at minimal the lone only NHL live game action available for the hours they are being played. That's how you grow the game. I mean, Toronto fans should watch other teams more likely to make the Stanley Cup Final this year and every other year as it is. Funny, isn't it, that the only reason anyone was on social media talking about the all-Ontario matchup was to point out why it shouldn't even have been played opposite the Winter Classic. That tells you all you need to know, doesn't it?